The morning mist hung low over Kensington Palace as Margaret Thompson adjusted her crisp white uniform for the third time. She had been working as a senior archivist in the Royal Correspondence Department for 15 years, but today felt different. Today marked exactly 25 years since Princess Diana's tragic death in Paris, and the weight of that anniversary seemed to press down on everyone within the palace walls. Margaret's job involves sorting, cataloging, and preserving thousands of letters, documents, and personal papers that flowed through the royal household daily. Most were routine correspondence from government officials, charity organizations, or well-wishers from around the world. But occasionally, something extraordinary would cross her desk. Something that could change the course of history or reveal secrets that the royal family preferred to keep buried. As she unlocked the heavy oak door to the archive room, Margaret noticed that her supervisor, James Whitmore, was already there. This was unusual, as James typically arrived much later in the day. He stood hunched over a particular filing cabinet, his normally composed demeanor replaced by visible anxiety. His hands shook slightly as he fumbled with a set of keys, and beads of sweat had formed on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Good morning, James," Margaret said quietly, setting down her leather satchel on her designated workstation. "You're here early today." James startled at her voice, nearly dropping the keys. He turned to face her, his face pale and drawn. "Margaret?" "Yes, well, there are some urgent matters that need attention. Some very delicate files that require immediate reorganization." Margaret had worked with James long enough to recognize the signs of extreme stress. His voice carried a tremor she had never heard before, and his eyes darted nervously toward the door as if he expected someone to burst in at any moment. Something was clearly wrong, but Margaret knew better than to press for details. In their line of work, discretion was not just expected, it was essential for survival. As the morning progressed, Margaret went about her usual tasks of sorting incoming correspondence. Letters from school children, invitations to charity events, and formal communications from various government departments filled her desk. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was happening around her. Palace staff members who normally chatted freely in the corridors now whispered in hushed tones, and several high-ranking officials had been seen entering and exiting the archive building throughout the morning. Around 11 o'clock, Margaret's attention was drawn to a particular envelope that had been placed in her urgent review pile. Unlike the typical formal correspondence she usually handled, this envelope was made of cream-colored paper with an elegant watermark. The handwriting on the front was distinctive, flowing and feminine, with careful attention to each letter formation. It was addressed simply to William in black ink that had slightly faded with age. Margaret's heart skipped a beat as she examined the envelope more closely. The paper quality, the handwriting style, and most tellingly, the small dove emblem pressed into the wax seal at the back. These were all characteristic of Princess Diana's personal correspondence. But that was impossible. Diana had died in 1997, and this envelope appeared to be much newer than that. With trembling fingers, Margaret carefully lifted the envelope to examine it under the magnifying lamp at her desk. The postmark was smudged and difficult to read, but she could make out what appeared to be a date from 2001, the year of Prince William's 40th birthday. Her mind raced with possibilities, each more incredible than the last. Had this letter been somehow preserved for decades, waiting to be delivered at the perfect moment? Was it a forgery created by someone with intimate knowledge of Diana's writing style? Or was there another explanation entirely, one that challenged everything Margaret thought she knew about the events surrounding the princess's death? As she contemplated these questions, Margaret became aware of footsteps approaching her workstation. She looked up to see James returning, but he was not alone. Accompanying him was Commander Richard Sterling, the head of Royal Protection Services. Sterling was an imposing figure with steel-gray hair and penetrating blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. His presence in the archive room was unprecedented and immediately set Margaret's nerves on edge. "Ms. Thompson," Sterling said in his crisp military voice, "I understand you've encountered something that requires our immediate attention." Margaret's mouth went dry. She hadn't told anyone about the envelope, yet somehow Sterling already knew about it. This could only mean one thing. Someone had been watching her, monitoring her every move as she worked. The realization that she was under surveillance in her own workplace sent a chill down her spine. "I'm not sure what you're referring to, Commander," Margaret replied carefully, instinctively moving to shield the envelope with her body. Sterling's expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "Miss Thompson, I'm going to ask you to cooperate fully with our investigation. The security of the royal family depends on it. Please step away from your desk." The weight of his words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Whatever was in this envelope, it was serious enough to bring the head of royal security directly to her workstation. She could feel her career, her reputation, and possibly her freedom hanging in the balance. But something deeper than professional concern drove her to resist. If this letter was truly from Princess Diana, it represented her final words to her son, words that had somehow been kept from him for over 2 decades. "Commander, with respect, I need to understand what authority you're operating under," Margaret said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "This is official royal correspondence, and I have procedures I must follow." The tension in the room became palpable. James shifted uncomfortably behind Sterling, clearly caught between his loyalty to his longtime colleague and his fear of the security chief. Other staff members who had been working quietly at nearby stations began to take notice of the confrontation, though they pretended to remain focused on their own tasks. Sterling stepped closer to Margaret's desk, his imposing presence filling her field of vision. "Miss Thompson, you seem to misunderstand the gravity of this situation. That envelope contains material that could destabilize the monarchy itself. It must be secured immediately." Margaret's pulse quickened. Sterling's admission that the envelope contained dangerous information only confirmed her suspicions about its significance. But it also raised new questions. How did Sterling know what was in the envelope if it hadn't been opened? Who had informed him of its existence? And most importantly, what secrets could be so threatening that they required the intervention of the highest levels of royal security? As these thoughts raced through her mind, Margaret made a decision that would change the course of her life forever. Instead of stepping away from her desk as ordered, she reached for the envelope and held it protectively against her chest. "I cannot surrender this correspondence without proper authorization," she said firmly. "If this is truly from Princess Diana to Prince William, then he has a right to receive it." The effect of her words was immediate and dramatic. Sterling's face darkened with anger, and James let out an audible gasp. Several other staff members stopped pretending to work and stared openly at the confrontation unfolding before them. "Ms. Thompson," Sterling said slowly, his voice carrying an unmistakable threat, "you are making a very serious mistake. Stand down immediately or face the consequences." Margaret felt her legs trembling beneath her, but she stood her ground. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she could hear her mother's voice from years ago, telling her to always do what was right, even when it was difficult. This envelope represented more than just a piece of correspondence. It was a connection between a mother and son that had been severed by tragedy, and possibly by deliberate interference. "I understand the consequences, Commander," Margaret replied. "But I also understand my duty to protect the integrity of royal correspondence. This letter belongs to Prince William, and I intend to see that he receives it." The standoff stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Sterling studied Margaret's face, clearly calculating his next move. Around them, the archive room had fallen completely silent, except for the ticking of an antique clock on the wall. Everyone present seemed to understand that they were witnessing a moment that could reshape the future of the monarchy. Finally, Sterling reached into his jacket and withdrew his phone. Without taking his eyes off Margaret, he dialed a number and waited for an answer. "Sir, we have a situation in the archives," he said quietly into the phone. "The Thompson woman is refusing to cooperate." "Yes, sir." "She has the item." "Understood." Sterling ended the call and returned the phone to his pocket. When he looked at Margaret again, his expression had changed from anger to something that might have been respect. Misassisted the book itself. "Thompson, you have 5 minutes to reconsider your position. After that, this matter will be taken out of both our hands. I suggest you use that time wisely." With that ominous warning, Sterling turned and walked toward the exit, gesturing for James to follow him. As they reached the door, Sterling paused and looked back at Margaret one final time. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I hope you know what you're doing." Alone at her desk with the mysterious envelope still pressed against her chest, Margaret tried to process what had just happened. In the span of a few minutes, she had defied direct orders from one of the most powerful figures in the royal hierarchy. There would be consequences, serious ones that could destroy her life and career. But looking down at the envelope in her hands, she felt a strange sense of peace. The handwriting on the front seemed to shimmer in the afternoon light filtering through the archive room's tall windows. William, written in Diana's distinctive script, carrying with it all the love, hope, and dreams of a mother who had been taken too soon. Whatever secrets this letter contained, Margaret was determined to ensure they reached their intended recipient. As she sat there gathering her courage for whatever was to come, Margaret began to formulate a plan. She had connections throughout the palace, people who shared her belief in doing what was right regardless of the personal cost. If the official channels were blocked, she would find another way. The letter would reach Prince William, even if it was the last thing she ever did. The clock on the wall continued its steady ticking, counting down the minutes until Sterling would return with reinforcements. Margaret carefully slipped the envelope into her jacket pocket and began to clear her desk. She had made her choice, and there was no turning back now. The forbidden letter would find its way home, and with it, the truth that someone had been desperate to hide for more than 2 decades. As footsteps echoed in the corridor outside, growing louder with each passing second, Margaret whispered a silent prayer to Princess Diana herself. "I won't let them keep your words from him," she promised. "Whatever it costs me, your son will know what you wanted to tell him." The door to the archive room burst open, and Margaret's real test was about to begin. Commander Sterling returned with 3 additional security officers, their heavy footsteps echoing through the archive room like thunder. Margaret could feel her heart pounding as she watched them spread out in formation, effectively blocking every exit. These weren't the usual palace guards she was accustomed to seeing during her daily work. These men wore dark suits with subtle earpieces, their trained eyes scanning the room for any potential threats or escape routes. "Miss Thompson," Sterling announced as he approached her desk, "your time is up. I'm going to ask you one final time to surrender the correspondence voluntarily." Margaret's hand instinctively moved to her jacket pocket where she had hidden the envelope. The cream-colored paper felt warm against her palm, as if it carried some remnant of Diana's own spirit. She looked around the room at her colleagues, most of whom had stopped pretending to work and were watching the confrontation with undisguised fascination and fear. Sarah Mitchell, a junior archivist who had worked under Margaret for 3 years, caught her eye from across the room. Sarah's expression was one of concern mixed with admiration. Margaret had always tried to mentor the younger woman, teaching her not just the technical aspects of their work, but also the importance of integrity in handling sensitive materials. Now Sarah was witnessing the ultimate test of those principles. "Commander," Margaret said, rising slowly from her chair, "I've been thinking about your request during these past few minutes, and I have some questions that need answering before I can comply." Sterling's jaw tightened visibly. He was clearly not accustomed to having his authority questioned, especially by someone he considered to be a minor palace employee. "This is not a negotiation, Thompson. You are in possession of classified material that poses a security risk to the royal family. If it's classified, then how do you know what it contains without having read it?" Margaret asked, her voice growing stronger with each word. "And if it's addressed to Prince William, by what authority are you preventing him from receiving his own correspondence?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sterling's companions shifted uncomfortably, and Margaret could see uncertainty flickering in their eyes. These were career security professionals who were trained to follow orders without question, but they were also intelligent men who could recognize when something didn't quite add up. "The contents of that letter are irrelevant," Sterling replied, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "What matters is that it represents a potential threat to the stability of the institution we've all sworn to protect." Margaret took a step closer to Sterling, her fear beginning to transform into determination. "Commander, I've worked in this archive for 15 years. I've handled correspondence from heads of state, sensitive diplomatic communications, and personal letters that could embarrass or damage the reputation of the royal family. I understand the concept of protecting the institution, but I also understand that some things are more important than institutional convenience." One of Sterling's men, a younger officer with kind eyes, leaned forward slightly as if to speak, then caught himself and resumed his rigid posture. Margaret noticed the momentary break in his composure and realized that not everyone in the room was comfortable with what was happening. "If this letter is truly from Princess Diana," Margaret continued, "then it represents her final gift to her son. How can we, as servants of the crown, justify keeping a mother's words from her child? Isn't our duty to serve the royal family, not to control them?" James Whitmore, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, suddenly cleared his throat. All eyes turned to him as he stepped forward, his face pale, but his voice steady. "Commander Sterling," James said carefully, "perhaps Ms. Thompson raises valid points about proper procedure. Shouldn't we verify the contents of this correspondence through official channels before taking such drastic action?" Sterling whirled around to face James, his eyes blazing with anger. "Mr. Whitmore, you seem to forget your position in this hierarchy. You are here to facilitate our operations, not to question them." But James had found his courage, inspired perhaps by Margaret's example. "With respect, sir, I've been supervisor of this department for 22 years. I've seen administrations come and go, and I've learned that the most dangerous mistakes are made when we act out of fear rather than principle." Margaret felt a surge of gratitude toward her supervisor. She had always respected James professionally, but now she was seeing a side of him she never knew existed, a man willing to stand up for what was right even when it put his own career at risk. The tension in the room was broken by the sound of Margaret's mobile phone ringing. She glanced at the screen and saw an unknown number, but something about the timing made her hesitate to ignore the call. "Answer it," Sterling ordered sharply. "But put it on speaker." Margaret accepted the call and touched the speaker button. A cultured male voice filled the room, speaking with the kind of refined accent that immediately suggested aristocratic background. "Mrs. Thompson? This is Lord Chamberlain Morrison. I understand there's been some confusion regarding a piece of correspondence in your possession." Margaret's breath caught. The Lord Chamberlain was one of the highest-ranking officials in the royal household, responsible for organizing all major ceremonial events and serving as a direct liaison to the monarch. His involvement elevated this situation to a level she had never imagined possible. "Lord Morrison," she replied carefully, "there has indeed been some confusion about proper procedures." "I see. And I understand that Commander Sterling is present with you now?" Sterling stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Lord Morrison, the situation is under control. We're following standard security protocols for handling potentially dangerous materials." There was a long pause before Lord Morrison responded, and when he did, his voice carried a note of cold authority that made everyone in the room straighten unconsciously. "Commander, I've just concluded a very interesting conversation with His Royal Highness Prince William. It seems he's become aware of this situation through certain unofficial channels. He has expressed a strong desire to review any correspondence that may have been intended for him, particularly anything that might have originated from his late mother." Margaret felt her knees go weak with relief and terror simultaneously. Prince William knew about the letter. Someone had managed to inform him despite Sterling's attempts to keep the matter contained. But this development also meant that the stakes had just increased exponentially. The future king himself was now involved in this confrontation. Sterling's face had gone completely white. "Sir, I was acting on direct orders from it." "Yes, Commander, I'm well aware of whose orders you were following," Lord Morrison interrupted. "However, those orders have now been superseded by higher authority. I'm instructing you to escort Miss Thompson and the correspondence in question to my office immediately." Margaret could hardly believe what she was hearing. Not only was she being rescued from this impossible situation, but she was being summoned to the office of one of the most powerful people in the royal hierarchy. The envelope in her pocket seemed to pulse with significance as she realized that its contents were about to be revealed to the very person for whom it was intended. Sterling looked like a man watching his career crumble before his eyes. "Lord Morrison, if I could speak with you privately about the sensitive nature of—" "Commander!" Lord Morrison's voice cut through the air like a blade. "The time for private conversations has passed." Ms. Ainsensor, "Thompson, please gather your belongings and accompany Commander Sterling to my office. I believe Prince William is quite anxious to resolve this matter." As Margaret collected her few personal items from her desk, she noticed Sarah Mitchell approaching cautiously. The younger woman's eyes were wide with amazement and concern. "Margaret," Sarah whispered, "are you going to be all right?" Margaret managed a weak smile. I honestly don't know, Sarah. But whatever happens, remember this moment. Remember that sometimes doing the right thing is more important than following orders. Sarah nodded solemnly, clearly understanding that she was witnessing something that would be remembered long after the immediate crisis had passed. Should I document what happened here today? For the archive records? The question caught Margaret off guard. In all the drama and tension, she hadn't considered the historical significance of what was unfolding. If this letter truly contained revelations that could impact the royal family, then the events of this day would themselves become part of history. Use your judgment, Sarah, Margaret replied. But remember that truth has a way of surfacing eventually, regardless of how many people try to bury it. Sterling, who had been listening to this exchange with growing impatience, finally stepped forward. Miss Thompson, we need to leave now. Lord Morrison doesn't like to be kept waiting. As they prepared to leave the archive room, Margaret took one last look around the space that had been her professional home for so many years. And the tall windows, the rows of filing cabinets filled with centuries of royal correspondence, the quiet atmosphere that had always provided her with a sense of peace and purpose. All of it seemed different now, charged with the electricity of momentous events. James approached her as she reached the door. Margaret, he said quietly, whatever's in that letter, I want you to know that I'm proud of how you've handled this situation. You've shown more courage today than most people display in a lifetime. Margaret felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. James, I'm sorry for putting you in this position. I know I've made your job more difficult. James shook his head firmly. You've reminded me why I chose this profession in the first place. We're not just clerks and administrators. We're guardians of history. Sometimes that requires more than just filing papers correctly. As they walked through the corridors of Kensington Palace toward Lord Morrison's office, Margaret found herself studying the paintings and photographs that lined the walls. Images of Diana in her prime, radiant and beautiful, seemed to watch their procession with knowing eyes. In one particular photograph, Diana was shown with a young William, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder as they both smiled at the camera. The sight of that photograph strengthened Margaret's resolve. Whatever consequences awaited her in Lord Morrison's office, she had done the right thing. A mother's words deserved to reach her son, regardless of what powerful people might want to prevent that connection. Sterling walked beside her in tense silence, his phone buzzing constantly with what Margaret assumed were urgent calls from his superiors. Each ring seemed to make him more agitated, and she could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool temperature in the palace corridors. As they approached the ornate double doors that marked the entrance to Lord Morrison's suite of offices, Margaret felt the envelope in her pocket one final time. Soon, the mystery of its contents would be revealed, and with it, the truth about why so many people had been desperate to keep it hidden. The doors swung open, and Margaret stepped forward to face whatever destiny awaited her and the forbidden letter that had changed everything. Lord Chamberlain Morrison's office was a study in understated elegance and historical significance. The walls were lined with portraits of monarchs spanning several centuries, and ancient leather-bound volumes filled mahogany bookcases that reached nearly to the ornate ceiling. Behind an imposing desk sat Lord Morrison himself, a distinguished man in his 70s, with silver hair and intelligent gray eyes that seemed to take in every detail of Margaret's appearance as she entered the room. But what truly took Margaret's breath away was the presence of Prince William himself, standing near one of the tall windows that overlooked the palace gardens. He was dressed casually in a navy sweater and dark trousers, but his posture and bearing left no doubt about his royal status. When he turned to face her, Margaret could see the unmistakable resemblance to his late mother, the same warm eyes and gentle expression that had made Diana beloved around the world. "Miss Thompson," Lord Morrison said, rising from his chair, "please, have a seat. I believe you've had quite a challenging morning." Margaret managed a small curtsy toward Prince William before taking the offered chair. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed them in her lap, the envelope still safely hidden in her jacket pocket. Commander Sterling remained standing near the door, his face a mask of professional composure that barely concealed his obvious discomfort. Prince William approached Margaret's chair, his expression thoughtful and kind. "Miss Thompson, I understand you've shown considerable courage today in protecting something you believe belongs to me. I'm grateful for your dedication to duty, even when it put you in a difficult position." Hearing these words directly from Prince William himself nearly overwhelmed Margaret's composure. She had spent her entire career serving the royal family from the shadows, never expecting to have direct contact with any of them, let alone under such extraordinary circumstances. "Your Royal Highness," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I simply felt that if the correspondence was intended for you, then you had a right to receive it." Prince William nodded slowly. "My mother always believed that truth should not be hidden, even when it was uncomfortable or inconvenient. She taught me that authentic communication was one of the most important gifts we could give to those we love." Lord Morrison cleared his throat gently. "Ms. Thompson, before we proceed, I think it's important for you to understand the broader context of today's events. What you've stumbled upon is not just a simple piece of correspondence, it's part of a much larger and more complex situation that has been developing for several years." Margaret looked back and forth between Lord Morrison and Prince William, trying to understand what he meant. "I'm not sure I follow, Lord Morrison." "Ms. Thompson," Prince William said, settling into the chair across from her. "About 3 years ago, we became aware that my mother had written several letters shortly before her death, letters that were intended to be delivered to Harry and me on specific milestone birthdays. They were to be her final gifts to us, words of love and guidance for moments when she could no longer be there in person." Margaret felt her heart racing as the implications of this revelation sank in. "Several letters? You mean there were others?" Prince William nodded, his expression growing more serious. "According to the information we've gathered, she wrote letters for my 30th birthday, my 40th birthday, and my 50th. She also wrote similar letters for Harry. The letter you've protected today was meant to reach me several months ago, on my 40th birthday. But why would anyone want to prevent you from receiving them?" Margaret asked, though she was beginning to suspect the answer. Lord Morrison leaned forward in his chair. "Biz Thompson, Princess Diana was known for her directness and her willingness to speak uncomfortable truths. There are individuals within the royal establishment who have been concerned that these final letters might contain revelations that could prove embarrassing or damaging to certain reputations." Margaret thought about the desperate urgency she had seen in Commander Sterling's behavior, the way he had insisted that the letter contained material that could destabilize the monarchy itself. "What kind of revelations?" Prince William exchanged a meaningful look with Lord Morrison before responding. "We don't know for certain, since we haven't been able to access any of the letters until now. But my mother was dealing with several difficult situations in the final months of her life. Her relationship with the royal family was strained. She had concerns about certain individuals' treatment of her and her sons, and she had discovered information about some activities that she considered unethical. The car accident in Paris," Margaret said suddenly, the words escaping before she could stop herself. The room fell silent. Sterling shifted uncomfortably near the door, and Lord Morrison's expression grew carefully neutral. Prince William, however, looked directly into Margaret's eyes with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see into her very soul. "Ms. Thompson," Prince William said quietly, "that's exactly the kind of speculation that has made these letters so controversial. My mother's death was a tragedy that has been investigated extensively by multiple authorities. But there are people who continue to believe that there are unanswered questions, and they worry that these letters might fuel additional conspiracy theories." Margaret realized she was treading into dangerous territory, but something compelled her to continue. "Your Royal Highness, if your mother wanted you to have these letters, doesn't your right to receive them outweigh other people's concerns about their content?" "That's precisely the argument I've been making," Prince William replied with a slight smile, "which is why I'm so grateful for your intervention today. You've helped ensure that my mother's wishes will finally be respected." Lord Morrison stood and walked to his desk, retrieving a brass letter opener with an ornate handle. "Ms. Thompson, if you're comfortable doing so, we'd like to open the letter now, in your presence. You've been the guardian of this correspondence, and it seems fitting that you should witness its delivery to its intended recipient." Margaret reached into her jacket pocket and withdrew the cream-colored envelope, her hands shaking as she placed it on the small table between herself and Prince William. The handwriting seemed even more beautiful in the soft lighting of Lord Morrison's office, and the dove emblem pressed into the wax seal caught the light like a small beacon of hope. Prince William took the letter opener from Lord Morrison and held it for a moment without moving. "I have to admit," he said softly, "I'm both eager and terrified to read what she wanted to tell me. My mother had a way of cutting straight to the heart of any matter, and I suspect this letter will be no exception." Margaret watched as Prince William carefully slid the letter opener under the wax seal, taking care not to damage the dove emblem. The seal gave way with a soft crack, and he gently opened the envelope to reveal several sheets of cream-colored writing paper covered in Diana's distinctive handwriting. As Prince William began to read silently, Margaret could see his expression changing. His eyes widened with surprise, then narrowed with what appeared to be anger, then softened with what could only be described as profound sadness. Lord Morrison watched anxiously from his position near the desk, while Sterling remained frozen by the door like a statue. After what felt like an eternity, Prince William looked up from the letter with tears in his eyes. "My God," he whispered, "no wonder they wanted to keep this from me." Margaret felt her heart skip a beat. "Your Royal Highness, is everything all right?" Prince William stood and walked to the window, still holding the letter in his hands. For a long moment he stared out at the palace gardens where he had played as a child, where his mother had taken him and Harry for picnics and informal family time away from the pressures of royal duty. "Ms. Thompson," Prince William said without turning around, "my mother's letter contains information about the circumstances surrounding her death that I've never heard before. She wrote about feeling threatened, about being followed, about fears for her safety and the safety of her sons. But more than that, she wrote about specific individuals who she believed were working against her, and specific incidents that she felt demonstrated a pattern of harassment and intimidation." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. She glanced at Commander Sterling, who looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. This was clearly the kind of information that certain people had been desperate to keep hidden. "She also wrote about her hopes for my future," Prince William continued, turning back to face the room, "about the kind of king she wanted me to become, the changes she hoped I would make to the monarchy, and the ways she wanted me to honor her memory through my actions and choices." Lord Morrison cleared his throat carefully. "Your Royal Highness, given the sensitive nature of some of this information, we'll need to consider very carefully how to proceed." Prince William folded the letter carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket. "Lord Morrison, I understand your concerns about protecting the institution. But my mother's final words to me are not going to be buried or sanitized to protect people who may have contributed to her suffering." Margaret felt a surge of admiration for Prince William's courage and integrity. He was choosing truth over convenience, even when that truth was likely to create significant complications for him personally. "There's something else," Prince William said, his voice taking on a tone of quiet determination. "My mother mentions in this letter that she had hidden copies of certain documents and evidence in a location that only I would be able to identify. She left me clues about where to find these materials, and she specifically requested that I share them with someone I trusted completely." Margaret's mind raced with the implications of this revelation. Princess Diana had not only written letters to her sons, she had also preserved evidence of whatever threats and harassment she had endured in the final months of her life. "Thompson," Prince William said, turning to face her directly, "my mother's letter contains a request that I want to share with you. She asked that if anything happened to her before these letters could be delivered, whoever eventually brought them to me should be thanked personally and invited to assist in ensuring that the full truth of her experiences is finally revealed." Margaret felt tears starting to form in her eyes. "Your Royal Highness, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll help me find the rest of what she left behind," Prince William replied. "Say you'll help me honor her memory by ensuring that her truth is finally told." Margaret looked around the room at the faces watching her. Lord Morrison with his concern for institutional stability, Commander Sterling with his obvious anxiety about the implications of what was being discussed, and Prince William with his quiet determination to fulfill his mother's final wishes. "Your Royal Highness," Margaret said firmly, "I would be honored to help you in any way I can." Prince William smiled for the first time since reading the letter. "Then we have work to do. My mother's clues suggest that she hid her evidence somewhere in Kensington Palace itself, somewhere that held special meaning for her and for me. We need to find those materials before anyone else realizes they exist." As the implications of this new quest began to sink in, Margaret realized that her quiet life as a royal archivist was about to become something far more significant and dangerous than she had ever imagined. The search for Princess Diana's hidden evidence began the following morning in the most unlikely of places, the palace's old nursery wing where William and Harry had spent much of their childhood. Margaret found herself walking through rooms she had only read about in historical documents, now accompanied by Prince William himself as they followed the cryptic clues contained in his mother's letter. She mentions where the teddy bears held court, Prince William said, reading from the letter as they entered what had once been his playroom. That could only mean this room. Harry and I had dozens of stuffed animals, and we used to set up elaborate royal courts with them during rainy afternoons. Margaret looked around the space, which had been preserved almost exactly as it was during the prince's childhood. Toys still sat on shelves. Small chairs were arranged around a child-sized table, and the walls were decorated with cheerful murals of storybook characters. It was both charming and heartbreaking to see this intimate glimpse into the domestic life of the royal family. They had been searching for 3 hours already, carefully examining every possible hiding place while trying to appear casual to any staff members who might observe them. Prince William had explained to curious servants that he was simply showing Miss Thompson some historical areas of the palace as part of her archival work. "Your mother also mentions beneath the Guardian of Dreams," Margaret said, consulting her own notes about the letter's contents. "Is there anything in this room that could be interpreted as a guardian?" Prince William studied the room thoughtfully, his eyes moving from corner to corner as he recalled childhood memories. "There!" he said suddenly, pointing to a large rocking horse that stood in the corner near the window. "My mother always called that horse Protector because she said it watched over our dreams while we slept." Margaret approached the antique rocking horse, examining its ornate carved details and well-worn saddle. It was clearly a valuable piece, probably dating back several generations of royal children. She ran her hands along its base, searching for any sign of a hidden compartment or loose panel. "Wait," Prince William said, kneeling beside the horse's base. "I remember now. This horse used to make a different sound when we rocked it. Not the normal creaking of wood, but something that rattled inside. Harry and I always wondered what caused that noise." Together, they carefully tipped the rocking horse to examine its underside. Margaret's trained eye immediately spotted something that didn't belong: a small metal panel that had been expertly sealed into the wooden base. It would have been invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. "Your Royal Highness," Margaret said quietly, "I think we've found something." Prince William retrieved a small toolkit from his pocket, something he had brought in anticipation of exactly this kind of discovery. Working carefully to avoid damaging the antique wood, he managed to remove the metal panel to reveal a hidden compartment lined with waterproof material. Inside the compartment were 2 items that made both Margaret and Prince William catch their breath. The first was a small digital memory device, the kind used in early digital cameras. The second was a sealed envelope marked with Diana's distinctive handwriting. For William, the complete truth. Prince William held both items in his hands, his face pale with the magnitude of what they had discovered. "She really did it," he whispered. She preserved evidence of everything she was experiencing. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the implications of their discovery. Princess Diana had not only documented her fears and concerns in letters, she had also collected actual evidence that could potentially support her claims about being threatened and harassed. "Your Royal Highness," Margaret said carefully, "we should be very careful about how we proceed. If this evidence contains the kind of information your mother suggested in her letter, there could be people who would go to great lengths to prevent it from becoming public." Prince William nodded grimly. "Which is exactly why we need to ensure it's handled properly. Margaret, I want you to help me review these materials before we decide what to do with them. You have the expertise to authenticate and preserve evidence, and, more importantly, you've already proven that you can be trusted." As they prepared to leave the nursery with their precious discoveries, Margaret couldn't help but notice how the afternoon light streaming through the windows seemed to illuminate the room with an almost ethereal quality. She imagined Princess Diana playing here with her young sons, never dreaming that she would one day use this same space to hide evidence that might reveal the truth about her final months. They made their way back to Margaret's office in the archive building, taking a circuitous route to avoid drawing attention. Once safely behind the locked door of Margaret's workspace, Prince William carefully opened the second envelope, while Margaret examined the digital memory device. This contains dozens of files, Margaret reported, connecting the device to her computer. Photographs, audio recordings, and what appear to be scanned documents. The timestamps show they were created in the final 6 months before your mother's death. Prince William was reading the letter from the second envelope, his expression growing more troubled with each page. Margaret, this letter contains specific names, dates, and incidents that my mother felt constituted a pattern of systematic harassment. She documents phone calls where she was threatened, instances where she was followed by unmarked vehicles, and attempts to interfere with her personal relationships. Margaret felt her hands trembling as she began to open the digital files. The first photographs showed what appeared to be surveillance equipment that had been installed near Diana's residence. The images were taken from inside her home, suggesting that she had discovered and documented the presence of unauthorized monitoring devices. "Your Royal Highness," Margaret said quietly, "these photographs show sophisticated surveillance equipment. This isn't the work of tabloid journalists or amateur stalkers. This level of technology and coordination suggests official or quasi-official involvement." Prince William joined her at the computer screen, his face growing darker as they reviewed file after file of evidence. Audio recordings captured threatening phone calls made to Diana's private numbers. Photographs documented the same vehicles appearing near her location on multiple occasions over several months. Scanned documents showed correspondence between various officials discussing Diana's activities and relationships in terms that suggested active monitoring and interference. One particular audio file made both Margaret and Prince William freeze in shock. It was a recording of Diana speaking to someone on the phone, clearly made without the other party's knowledge. In the recording, Diana confronted the caller about surveillance and harassment, demanding that it stop immediately. The voice that responded was cold and professional, making veiled threats about Diana's safety and that of her children if she continued to make difficulties. "My God," Prince William whispered. She was recording her own phone calls to protect herself. Margaret paused the audio playback, her mind racing with the implications of what they were hearing. "Your Royal Highness, this evidence suggests that your mother was living under a level of scrutiny and pressure that goes far beyond normal security protocols. This appears to be active intimidation." As they continued reviewing the materials, a pattern emerged that was both clear and terrifying. Princess Diana had been systematically monitored, followed, and threatened by individuals who appeared to have official backing and unlimited resources. Her every movement was tracked, her relationships were interfered with, and her attempts to live independently were met with escalating pressure to conform to expectations about her behavior. The final audio recording was the most chilling of all. It was Diana speaking alone, apparently making notes for herself about the evidence she had collected. In her own voice, she laid out her fears about what might happen to her if she continued to resist the pressure being applied to her life. "I know they're planning something," Diana's voice said clearly through the computer speakers. "The threats are becoming more specific, and I'm being told that accidents can happen to anyone, even members of the royal family. If anything happens to me, I want my sons to know that it wasn't really an accident. I want them to have this evidence so they can understand what really happened and why." The room fell silent except for the humming of Margaret's computer. Prince William sat back in his chair, his face a mixture of grief, anger, and determination. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face as she realized they had just heard Princess Diana's own voice expressing her fears about the circumstances that would ultimately claim her life. "Margaret," Prince William said finally, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes, "we cannot let this evidence disappear or be suppressed. My mother risked everything to preserve this record, and she trusted that someday it would reach me. Now I have to decide what to do with it." Margaret understood the enormous weight of the decision facing Prince William. The evidence they had discovered could potentially reopen investigations into Diana's death, challenge official narratives that had been accepted for decades, and implicate powerful individuals in activities that went far beyond acceptable bounds of security or protocol. "Your Royal Highness," Margaret said carefully, "whatever you decide to do with this evidence, you need to ensure your own safety first. If the people your mother was documenting are still in positions of power, they may see you as a threat now that you have access to this information." Prince William nodded grimly. "Which is why I need your help with one more thing, Margaret. I want to create secure copies of all this evidence and place them with multiple trusted individuals. If anything happens to the originals or to me, I want to ensure that my mother's truth survives." As they began the process of carefully copying and securing Princess Diana's evidence, Margaret realized that they had crossed a line from which there could be no return. They were no longer just preserving historical documents. They were guardians of a truth that could reshape public understanding of one of the most significant events in modern royal history. The forbidden letter had led them to something far more significant than anyone could have imagined, and now they faced the challenge of ensuring that Princess Diana's final gift to her son would not be silenced by those who had tried so hard to keep it hidden. 6 months after discovering Princess Diana's hidden evidence, Margaret found herself in a situation she never could have imagined. She was seated in a secure conference room at the offices of one of London's most prestigious law firms, surrounded by barristers, investigators, and journalists who had spent months verifying and corroborating the materials she and Prince William had uncovered. The evidence had proven to be even more significant than they initially realized. Independent technical analysis confirmed the authenticity of the recordings and photographs, while investigative journalists had tracked down several of the individuals mentioned in Diana's documentation. Some had agreed to speak on condition of anonymity, providing additional evidence that supported Diana's claims about systematic harassment and intimidation. Prince William sat at the head of the conference table, looking older and more serious than he had 6 months ago. The weight of his mother's revelations had clearly taken a toll, but his determination to see justice done had never wavered. Beside him sat his legal counsel, a distinguished woman named Patricia Blackwood, who specialized in cases involving institutional accountability and human rights violations. "Ladies and gentlemen," Patricia announced, "we're here today to finalize our decision about how to proceed with the evidence Princess Diana preserved regarding the circumstances of her final months. His Royal Highness has asked me to present the options we've identified after extensive legal and ethical review." Margaret listened intently as Patricia outlined 3 potential courses of action. The first was to release all the evidence immediately to the media, creating maximum public impact but potentially compromising ongoing investigations. The second was to present the evidence to official authorities and allow them to determine appropriate next steps, though this risked the materials being suppressed or ignored. The third option was a carefully orchestrated public disclosure that would simultaneously release the evidence to multiple independent entities, ensuring it couldn't be contained or suppressed. "My mother chose to trust me with this evidence," Prince William said when Patricia finished her presentation. "She believed that someday I would have the courage and the authority to ensure her truth was told. I've made my decision about how to honor that trust." Margaret felt her heart racing as she waited to hear Prince William's choice. Over the past months, they had become unlikely allies in this quest for justice, bound together by their shared commitment to preserving Princess Diana's legacy and ensuring her voice was finally heard. "I've decided to pursue the third option," Prince William announced. "In 1 week's time, this evidence will be simultaneously released to investigative journalists at 5 major news organizations, delivered to appropriate legal authorities in 3 countries, and presented to an independent human rights organization that specializes in cases involving abuse of power." The room erupted in controlled activity as the legal team began discussing logistics and timing. Margaret sat quietly, processing the magnitude of what was about to happen. Princess Diana's evidence was finally going to see the light of day, potentially vindicating her concerns and revealing truths that had been hidden for more than 2 decades. "Margaret," Prince William said, approaching her as the meeting began to break up, "I want you to know that none of this would have been possible without your courage that day in the archive room. You risked everything to ensure my mother's letter reached me, and because of that, her story will finally be told." Margaret felt tears forming in her eyes. "Your Royal Highness, I only did what felt right at the time. I never imagined it would lead to something of this magnitude." "That's exactly why you were the right person to find that letter," Prince William replied. "My mother always believed that ordinary people doing the right thing could change the world. You've proven her right." As they prepared to leave the law firm's offices, Patricia Blackwood approached Margaret with a formal-looking document. "Miss Thompson, His Royal Highness has asked me to present you with this letter of commendation for your service to the royal family. It acknowledges your role in preserving and protecting correspondence of historic significance." Margaret accepted the letter with shaking hands, realizing that her life had been permanently changed by the events of the past 6 months. She was no longer just a quiet archivist working in the shadows of royal history. She had become a key figure in one of the most significant revelations in modern royal history. 1 week later, Margaret watched from her sitting room as the story broke simultaneously across multiple news outlets around the world. The headlines were dramatic and powerful. Princess Diana's secret evidence reveals years of systematic harassment, and hidden recordings expose royal surveillance scandal, and Diana's final letter, a mother's warning from beyond the grave. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming.